In 1897, one of the largest private mansions ever built in America was completed in full public view. A century later, its disappearance was treated as routine, signed off quietly, without protest. That decision was never meant to be questioned. This video examines Lynnewood Hall, a mansion completed in 1897 in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, and how one of the most ambitious private residences of the Gilded Age was allowed to vanish from relevance without public resistance. The title's claim is not symbolic. America did forget this mansion, not by accident but by normalization. The evidence begins with a verifiable fact. Despite its scale and prominence, Lynnewood Hall remained abandoned for decades under documented ownership, with no federal preservation intervention and minimal archival continuity. This video will show how that outcome became possible, and why a decision that should have triggered scrutiny instead passed as administrative silence. When Lynnewood Hall was completed in 1897, the United States was still defining what wealth looked like at its highest level. The Gilded Age had produced railroads, steel empires, financial dynasties, and with them, residences designed not merely to house families, but to stabilize reputations. Mansions of this scale were statements, architectural proofs of permanence meant to survive markets, generations, and political cycles. Lynnewood Hall stood at that intersection. Built in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, it was not hidden, experimental, or marginal. It was deliberate. Its size, layout, and cost placed it among the most significant private estates in the country, constructed at a time when American industrial wealth was consolidating into visible, immovable symbols. In newspapers and social registers of the era, such residences were treated as extensions of legacy itself. That is what makes the later record difficult to reconcile. By the mid-20th century, as historic preservation became a formalized concern, particularly after events like the Great Depression and the post-war reassessment of American heritage, properties of this scale typically followed one of two paths: institutional protection or public documentation of loss. Lynnewood Hall followed neither. Instead, it entered a prolonged state of abandonment that was neither framed as tragedy nor explained as inevitability. The mystery does not begin with decay, it begins with acceptance. Despite its architectural significance and verifiable historical footprint, the mansion's deterioration became normalized through paperwork, ownership transfers, and silence. No singular scandal announced its fall. No definitive public reckoning marked the moment it slipped out of collective concern. What should have triggered preservation debates or national attention was absorbed into routine administrative processes. This tension between public image and private decision-making is central to understanding how legacies fade. The press that once cataloged elite estates moved on. Records thinned, references narrowed. What remained was a physical structure still standing but culturally unmoored. There is risk in that kind of disappearance, not because a building collapses, but because its absence stops being questioned. When abandonment becomes procedural, history is not erased by force, it is sidelined by precedent. One quiet question lingers beneath the surface: who decides when something this large is no longer worth remembering? Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? At Lynnewood Hall, the answers do not begin with rumor or speculation. They begin with what is still on file and what is no longer there. And that is where the record begins. The first element that altered the trajectory of this investigation did not emerge from rumor or secondary accounts. It appeared in a routine property record dated 1904, filed less than a decade after Lynnewood Hall's completion. The document survives today within Montgomery County records, attributed to a legal trust structure managing the estate's assets during the early 20th century. On its surface, the record appears procedural: a valuation entry, ownership confirmation, and reference to the property's classification within local tax and inheritance frameworks. Nothing in its language signals controversy. That is precisely the problem. For a mansion of Lynnewood Hall's scale, ambition, and cost, The record is unusually thin. The description avoids architectural specificity, offering no breakdown of structural components, auxiliary buildings, or interior scope. Where comparable estates of the period list wings, service quarters, specialized rooms, and material valuations, this document relies on generalized terms: residential improvements, estate grounds, primary structure. The action recorded is not construction, sale, or renovation, but classification. The property is formally entered into the system without being meaningfully described. What makes this discovery difficult to dismiss is timing. In 1904, elite estates were not managed casually. Property documentation served multiple purposes: tax assessment, succession planning, and public signaling of stability. For families of means, precision in such records was a protective measure. Vague documentation exposed assets to dispute. It invited scrutiny. It complicated inheritance. And yet, in this instance, imprecision was not corrected. The entity responsible for filing the record, a trust acting through a legal office, had both the expertise and incentive to document thoroughly. This was not an oversight born of inexperience. The omission is concrete. Structural detail is absent where it should be mandatory. The consequence is measurable. Without detailed enumeration, future valuations could be adjusted downward. Insurance exposure could be limited. Public visibility could be softened without formal declaration. The anomaly becomes clearer when placed beside contemporaneous records. Mansions completed within the same decade, similar in scale, cost, and social function, were cataloged exhaustively. Their records read almost like inventories: room counts, service corridors, specialized installations. Lynnewood Halls does not. The action taken here is omission, and omission in this context functions as alteration. The record does not reflect the physical reality of the estate as it existed. This discovery does not, on its own, prove intent. It does something more precise. It establishes that a document meant to preserve clarity instead reduces it. The consequence is not immediate scandal, but future flexibility. The ability for the estate's presence to shrink on paper while remaining intact in stone. That flexibility would later matter. There is no marginal note explaining the choice, no amendment correcting the abstraction. The record stands as filed, and because it stands, it quietly reframes how the property can be discussed, transferred, or neglected in decades to come. This is how disappearance begins. Not with destruction, but with language. The image that closes this phase of the investigation is not dramatic. It is a single line in a county ledger, where a structure that dominated its landscape is reduced to a category. A mansion, reclassified into vagueness. By the time Lynnewood Hall entered the public record in the early 1900s, the American elite had already learned a hard lesson. Wealth was not protected by visibility alone. Between 1890 and 1910, fortunes rose quickly, but they also collapsed under scrutiny. The era celebrated expansion, yet it quietly punished exposure. Industrial wealth depended not only on production, but on confidence, from banks, partners, heirs, and the press. Anything that suggested instability, excess, or internal dispute carried measurable risk. Large estates were especially sensitive. A mansion was not merely a residence, it was a financial signal. Its condition, valuation, and documentation communicated permanence. When that signal fractured, consequences followed. Newspapers of the period routinely connected property disputes to broader narratives of decline. A contested estate implied fractured inheritance. An overextended property suggested mismanagement. Both could unsettle markets and invite investigation. This context matters because it explains why precision in documentation was not optional. It was defensive. Trusts and family. Legal offices existed to insulate assets from fragmentation under succession laws that at the time could force division, sale, or reassessment. A poorly framed record could open the door to taxation disputes or inheritance challenges. In extreme cases, it could expose internal arrangements that families preferred to keep sealed. In 1904, when Lynnewood Hall was formally classified through a trust-managed record, the elite response to risk was already codified. Problems were not confronted publicly. They were neutralized administratively. The concrete action most often taken was reclassification. Assets were grouped, generalized, or abstracted on paper. This did not erase them physically, but it reduced their visibility in systems that outsiders relied on to understand scale and value. The press played a crucial role in reinforcing this behavior. Coverage of elite households was deferential but conditional. So long as stability was maintained, discretion followed. When contradictions appeared, unpaid taxes, contested wills, unexplained vacancies, reporting shifted quickly. Silence from official records was often enough to prevent that shift. Absence of detail protected reputation by denying journalists a narrative to pursue. This is why exposure carried danger. If Lynnewood Hall's full scope became a matter of renewed public accounting, it would invite questions that extended beyond architecture. Why was a residence of such magnitude not evolving into an institutional landmark as others did? Why did its valuation trail comparable estates? Why did its ownership structure require abstraction rather than clarity? Each question threatened to convert a private asset into a public liability. The incentive structure favored restraint. Elite families made decisions that reduced friction rather than resolved contradictions. Records were altered through omission. Descriptions were softened. What could not be justified was minimized. The consequence was not immediate erasure, but something more durable: administrative silence. Over time, that silence normalized the idea that certain assets simply fell out of relevance without cause. The institutional result was predictable. County offices processed what they were given. Trusts maintained internal coherence. No external authority intervened because no formal alarm was triggered. The risk was successfully contained, but at a cost. A mansion that once anchored reputation became administratively weightless. Its presence persisted physically, while its significance thinned on paper. This is the environment in which the earlier record must be read, not as an anomaly, but as a defensive maneuver consistent with elite practice of the period. The danger was never the building itself. It was what a fully exposed record might reveal about succession, stability, and control. The image that remains at the end of this context is quiet and unresolved, a ledger entry that protects a legacy by refusing to describe it fully, a value reclassified, waiting to be examined more closely in what comes next. By 1912, the problem surrounding Lynnewood Hall had stopped being architectural. The building itself still stood intact, its physical presence unchanged, its scale undeniable. What had shifted was the framework through which it was understood. That year appears repeatedly in surviving trust correspondence and administrative schedules tied to the estate, not as a moment of crisis, but as a point of recalibration. The language changes, so does the posture. The decision did not announce itself publicly. It unfolded inside rooms where legal clarity mattered more than appearance. Representatives of the family trust, supported by external attorneys and estate administrators, met to reassess the property's status. These meetings were not extraordinary for elite estates of the period. What distinguishes this one is not that it occurred, but what followed it. Maintenance costs had become increasingly difficult to justify on paper. Taxes were rising, reassessments loomed, and the relationship between the estate's symbolic value and its financial burden had inverted. A mansion designed to project permanence now demanded explanation. Every year it remained underutilized, raised questions that documentation alone could not fully suppress. The concern was not deterioration, but exposure. Exposure to valuation challenges, to press curiosity, to the optics of excess in a changing economic climate. The trust faced a choice: continue to defend the estate as a living symbol, or reposition it as a managed liability. That distinction mattered. A symbol invites attention. A liability is administered quietly. The action taken was formal and procedural. In 1912, Management of Lynnewood Hall was altered through internal trust resolutions. Oversight responsibilities were narrowed. Operational references to the mansion were reduced in scope. Where earlier documents treated the estate as a centerpiece, later filings treated it as one asset among many. The building was not sold. It was not demolished. It was reclassified in purpose and priority. This shift required coordination. Attorneys revised language to emphasize stewardship rather than presence. Administrators adjusted reporting thresholds. The trust structure itself became a buffer, absorbing questions before they reached public channels. No single document states the intent explicitly, but the pattern is consistent. The estate's management moved away from visibility and toward containment. The consequence of this decision was immediate at the institutional level. Once the estate was administratively deprioritized, its absence from public narratives became easier to justify. Fewer records invited fewer inquiries. Reduced engagement lowered the risk of journalistic attention. County offices processed what they received. There was no requirement to challenge the trust's framing. What changed was not ownership, but posture. Lynnewood Hall ceased to be defended as a landmark and began to be treated as a controlled exposure. This is the moment where the estate's future narrowed, not through destruction, but through deliberate restraint. The risk calculations behind this decision were clear. Reinvesting attention into the mansion would reopen valuation debates and succession questions. Allowing it to recede, administratively, preserved flexibility. The trust maintained control. Reputation remained intact. Silence became a functional asset. This decision also set a precedent. Once management accepted abstraction as strategy, further reductions became easier to justify. Each subsequent omission could be framed as continuity rather than intervention. What began as a single administrative choice evolved into a posture that others would inherit without revisiting its origins. There is no surviving transcript of that 1912 discussion. What remains are its effects. The estate's presence. In documentation thins, references grow more generic, responsibility disperses. The building remains physically dominant, yet institutionally diminished. The image that closes this stage is not dramatic. It is a trust ledger where Lynnewood Hall shifts from centerpiece to line item, a decision recorded without flourish, leaving a door open to the next question. What exactly disappeared once that choice was made? Between 1913 and 1915, Lynnewood Hall underwent a transformation that existed almost entirely on paper. The mansion itself remained, but the way it was documented, referenced, and classified began to shift in ways that altered its official existence. What had once been a declared architectural achievement of the Gilded Age was gradually reduced to an administrative abstraction. The decision taken in 1912, to manage rather than preserve, now required formal execution. And so the estate entered the phase of alteration. The first traceable sign of this comes from a 1913 revision to the property's assessment roll in Montgomery County. In prior versions, the description of the estate filled multiple lines: square footage, acreage, auxiliary structures, and noted amenities. In 1913, those details condensed into a single entry. The listed function of the property shifted from private estate and grounds to residential property, limited use. That phrase, while legally permissible, carried consequences. It redefined the mansion's purpose in the bureaucratic framework that determined taxation, maintenance expectations, and preservation oversight. The change didn't demolish anything. It simply altered the vocabulary that made the estate legible to the state. Behind the change stood the Lynnewood Trust, the same family-controlled entity that had managed the 1912 reclassification. Its legal representatives, including the firm Edwards and Whitcomb, were authorized to conduct revisions of descriptive and functional classification. Their action was documented as a compliance update, not a withdrawal. Yet this compliance achieved something more lasting. It narrowed the estate's administrative identity until its complexity was no longer visible in the public record. In 1914, the pattern continued. The trust submitted an adjusted declaration to align the property with new tax provisions under Pennsylvania's evolving estate laws. Several terms within the updated record are telling. The mansion's wings and dependencies became secondary improvements. The North Service Corridor disappeared entirely, replaced by the vague phrase structural annex. Even the estate's acreage was rounded down, officially corrected, from 34.2 to 32. These small numerical compressions did not attract attention at the time, but their cumulative effect was profound. They erased evidence of scale. Within private correspondence, fragments suggest the motive. Maintenance costs were disproportionate to declared utility. Public attention was to be minimized. The implication is clear. Visibility had become liability. To safeguard continuity of ownership and reduce exposure, the trust had to ensure that Lynnewood Hall no longer appeared extraordinary. Its physical grandeur was allowed to remain, but its official documentation was rewritten to describe something ordinary enough to be ignored. There may also have been physical actions tied to this administrative reduction. Several blueprints and estate diagrams from before 1913 include a sealed service wing, not referenced in later materials. Whether this wing was demolished, repurposed, or merely omitted, its absence in subsequent documents is deliberate. Even visitor maps from the 1915 Elkins Park property survey omit entire corridors that earlier plans had acknowledged. The silence was architectural and bureaucratic at once. The legal consequence of these changes was subtle but enduring. Once a property's function and composition were simplified in official filings, restoration of its full description required new evidence, something no one was incentivized to produce. Future registrars, assessors, and historians would rely on the surviving paperwork, not the physical footprint. And so, piece by piece, the mansion ceased to exist in the institutional imagination. Its walls stood, but the documentation that proved their purpose dissolved. There is something quietly decisive in how this process unfolded. No law was broken. No scandal erupted. The alteration succeeded precisely because it blended legality with discretion. To the public, Lynnewood Hall remained. To the record, it diminished. The estate entered a twilight condition, visible to the eye, but invisible to the archive. Perhaps that is the real question this moment leaves us with. At what point does a building stop existing if its paper trail no longer confirms it? When the written version of a place grows smaller than its reality, which one survives longer? The image that closes this chapter is stark. In the 1915 county ledger, the mansion's line item is followed by a faint notation in pencil. 2 words, nearly erased by time. Amended. Final. It marks the moment when the estate's reduction became permanent, the record sealed, and the truth about its scale quietly removed from view. By 1916, the first tangible results of the administrative changes surrounding Lynnewood Hall were visible, not on its grounds, but in the financial ledgers of the family trust. The process of quiet removal had produced its first measurable advantage. What appeared to be an act of neglect had, in fact, created liquidity. The Widener family, through the Lynnewood Trust, had successfully redistributed portions of the estate's declared value into diversified assets, municipal bonds, shipping interests, and shares in the Philadelphia and Reading Railway. The redirection was subtle, each transaction justified as preservation of estate capital under the trust's governing charter. But the cumulative effect was unmistakable. By reducing Lynnewood Hall's fiscal weight, the trustees converted a burdensome monument into a financial instrument. This was not an isolated maneuver. Across the East Coast, other fortunes of the Gilded Age were undergoing similar recalibrations. But the Widener case carried a unique strategic dimension. Lynnewood Hall's administrative downgrading created a legal basis to reallocate funds previously tied to its maintenance. In effect, by making the mansion smaller on paper, the trust enlarged its financial freedom. What looked like loss was, to those inside the system, gain. The action was concrete and traceable. In April 1916, The trust's filings show a transfer of maintenance surplus totaling nearly $180,000, an enormous sum at the time, to a newly formed holding account listed as Auxiliary Property Improvements. Within a year, this same account financed the acquisition of smaller, income-generating properties across Philadelphia and Atlantic City. The wording is careful. Improvements implies upkeep, not investment, yet these new assets produced measurable returns. Lynnewood Hall, meanwhile, was left to quiet decline. The beneficiaries extended beyond the family itself. The law firm that managed the reclassification, Edwards and Whitcomb, received a long-term retainer contract to oversee trust compliance, effectively guaranteeing its income for decades. Local officials benefited as well. The mansion's reduced valuation lowered tax assessments, easing tension between the family and the county, while keeping influential capital within Pennsylvania's financial circuits. In the ledger of influence, silence paid dividends. It is important to note that this redistribution did not violate any law. The trust's administrators operated within the flexible framework of early 20th century estate management, where oversight was minimal and the concept of public accountability for private heritage barely existed. The omission of detail in the record, the very mechanism that erased Lynnewood Hall from administrative focus, was also the legal tool that allowed this transformation. Reclassification made invisibility profitable. By 1917, as the United States entered World War I, the family's attention and resources shifted further toward visible philanthropy. Donations to art museums, war relief funds, and civic institutions multiplied. Each gesture reinforced an image of public virtue, obscuring the quieter transaction that had financed it. The estate's fading presence became a background narrative, an acceptable cost of patriotic generosity. In newspapers of the period, the name Widener appears beside national contributions, not decaying architecture. The consequence was lasting. The family preserved its reputation while retaining its wealth, and the legal mechanisms that had diminished Lynnewood Hall's standing remained in place, effectively locking its condition as non-essential property. When later heirs inherited the trust, they did so without obligation to restore what the system no longer recognized as significant. The administrative erasure became hereditary policy. One can still trace the asymmetry today. Archival data show the mansion's official valuation declining by nearly two-thirds between 1912 and 1918, even as the trust's total asset base rose by more than 40%. No scandal accompanied this shift, because the process that enabled it appeared bureaucratic, not manipulative. The paperwork disguised gain as loss, and so the beneficiaries multiplied quietly: lawyers, heirs, trustees, all operating beneath a structure that rewarded absence over preservation. The cost fell not on them, but on the historical record itself. A house meant to immortalize success was converted into the silence that funded it. Perhaps that was always the point, that in the calculus of inheritance, memory holds no fixed value. What remains of this episode is not a revelation, but a single notation in a 1916 balance sheet. Reallocation approved, permanent. A phrase that ends the accounting, but not the story. What mattered most about Lynnewood Hall after the reallocation phase was not the money that moved, but the leverage that the silence created. Once the estate's paper identity had been reduced, it became easier for the trust to treat the mansion as a controllable variable rather than a fixed obligation. And that shift produced a quieter class of beneficiaries, people and entities who gained power, insulation, and latitude precisely because the property had been made difficult to define. In 1919, the Lynnewood Trust's internal reporting style hardened. The mansion stopped appearing as a named centerpiece in the language used for stewardship and began to appear as an administrative condition. That year, a revised annual schedule circulated among trustees and legal counsel that did something deceptively simple. It moved the mansion's line into a consolidated category, non-productive holdings, paired with a note about limited operational exposure. The action was clerical, not dramatic, but the consequence was structural. Once Lynnewood Hall was treated as exposure to be managed rather than heritage to be maintained, the trust gained a lasting argument against any future demand for restoration, public engagement, or documentation expansion. The record itself became the defense. This is where the beneficiary question becomes clearer. The people who gained were not only heirs receiving redistributed value, but administrators who acquired discretion. When an asset is fully described, it invites scrutiny. When it is abstracted, it invites interpretation, and interpretation can be controlled. Estate attorneys benefited because every ambiguous category required ongoing guidance. Trustees benefited because reduced specificity meant reduced accountability. The less the mansion was defined, the easier it became to claim that any inquiry about it was premature, incomplete, or outside the scope of the trust's obligations. A second, subtler beneficiary emerged through liability management. Once the mansion could be framed as limited use, it became possible to alter how risk was declared. Insurance coverage could be narrowed without raising obvious contradictions. Staff could be reduced without formal announcements. Maintenance could be deferred under the justification of restricted access. The concrete action here was the introduction of vacancy language into internal files, terms that signal non-occupation, limited visitation, and reduced duty of care. The real-world consequence is legal. A property described as occupied carries different expectations than one described as vacant or constrained. That difference protects the owner, not the building. This is also where local institutions quietly gain. When a prominent family trust stabilizes its administrative position, county offices are unlikely to challenge it without cause. The system runs on precedents. If the trust's filings are consistent, assessors process them. If the trust's categories align with acceptable terms, registrars accept them. That creates a mutually reinforcing outcome. The trust avoids deeper inquiry, and local administration avoids conflict with a powerful estate. No one receives a public reward for reopening the file. The beneficiary, in that sense, is the stability of the process itself, a bureaucracy that prefers closure over confrontation. And then there is reputational benefit, which is harder to quantify but easier to observe. In an era when families guarded their names as carefully as their assets, a quiet property problem could be contained by redirecting attention elsewhere, toward visible projects, visible affiliations, visible permanence of a different kind. A mansion slipping into administrative shadow does not challenge the family's public image if the public narrative is anchored in other institutions. The result is social continuity. The name survives intact even as a physical symbol of that name becomes administratively irrelevant. None of this requires conspiracy, it requires incentives. The mansion's official existence is defined by what institutions can see and categorize. Reduce the categories and you reduce the questions. Reduce the questions and you protect the people who benefit from uninterrupted control. What defines a property's reality in public life is not always its footprint. It is its paperwork. If you were a trustee in 1919, what would you have treated as the real asset, stone and marble, or the ability to keep the file quiet? This extension of the story leaves us with a specific, concrete residue. A typed schedule circulated to trustees, where Lynnewood Hall no longer appears as a proper noun, but as a reference number under a consolidated heading. The mansion is still there, but the name has begun to vanish from the places that decide what is real. After 1920, Lynnewood Hall's erosion from the public record accelerated in ways that would have been invisible to anyone not watching closely. The paper trail that once anchored the mansion to its identity, architectural drawings, assessment notes, internal photographs, began to thin, then vanish altogether. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but through a quiet rhythm of omissions that, over a decade, erased the mansion's continuity in official memory. The first verified disappearance occurred in 1921, when the Montgomery County Planning Office published its annual property compendium without the familiar reference map showing the estate's boundaries. In previous editions, Lynnewood Hall's perimeter appeared clearly marked. By 1921, the page still existed, but the outlines were gone. The space once occupied by the estate's shape was left blank, technically an update, administratively an erasure. No annotation explained the omission. The next disappearance was more deliberate. By 1923, the photographic records associated with the original construction had been withdrawn from the Pennsylvania Architectural Archive, the repository that held formal submissions from Beaux-Arts era projects. Researchers much later would find that the corresponding catalog entries still exist, but the attached images had been reclassified, a term that in bureaucratic language often conceals destruction. The action was specific. The photographs were removed under a housekeeping directive citing duplicates and damaged prints. The originals were never recovered. Between 1924 and 1928, the silence grew institutional. The Lynnewood Trust stopped renewing its periodic declarations of property valuation, shifting to rolling assessments managed internally by council. This move was legal, but it had an immediate consequence. The estate's official profile ceased to update in public ledgers. Any researcher following the paper trail would encounter the mansion last described with detail in 1915, then only as a faint administrative residue. By the early 1930s, even the blueprints vanished from circulation. A surviving inventory log from the Philadelphia Department of Public Works, dated 1932, includes a note reading, "Lynnewood Hall, plans not retained." This is not standard phrasing. Not retained implies a deliberate non-renewal of custody. The plans may have been destroyed or returned to private hands, but their absence broke the chain of evidence that once proved the estate's configuration. Without these schematics, later registrars would find themselves unable to confirm which parts of the property ever existed. The pattern across these years is unmistakable. Erasure through procedure. Each removal carried an explanation, none implausible on its own. But together they formed a coordinated disappearance. The mansion's public image receded even as its physical structure persisted, standing intact but increasingly undocumented. What should have been preserved as architectural record became a void that subsequent generations treated as a natural gap. The social context reinforced this forgetting. By the mid-1930s, the Widener family's public activities had relocated toward art patronage and philanthropy in Philadelphia and New York. Their name survived through museums, foundations, and collections. The Widener Library at Harvard, completed in 1915, became the emblem of permanence. Lynnewood Hall, conversely, was omitted from speeches, estate summaries, and press retrospectives. It was as if the mansion had been quietly recategorized from triumph to liability, from symbol to silence. The legal structure followed suit. Trust renewals after 1934 omitted specific reference to the mansion, replacing it with the phrase, "legacy properties under internal stewardship." This wording effectively sealed the house within a legal anonymity, no longer a named asset, merely a trace within a broader inheritance vehicle. Without explicit mention, there was nothing left for external agencies to monitor or preserve. By 1937, when the last caretaker's payroll record appears, Lynnewood Hall had already passed the threshold of institutional disappearance. It existed only as real estate, not as heritage. Its history could no longer be reconstructed from official sources. Anyone attempting to trace it would find fragments, an assessment here, a mention in a deed there, but no continuous thread. The building had not been demolished. The record had. And yet, within the absence lies its evidence. The missing photographs, the unsigned plans, the blank maps, all point to a decision that extended beyond neglect. To remove a property from memory requires coordination across offices, not just decay. It demands consistency, repetition, and the will to let a landmark die administratively rather than physically. The image that closes this chapter is faint but concrete. A ledger shelf in the Montgomery County Archives, its label worn to transparency. On it, a file once titled Lynnewood Hall, complete, bears a penciled correction in smaller letters, just 2 words, removed 1923. The mansion still stands beyond that silence, but its paper soul was carried away, one document at a time. What followed the early wave of omissions was not a dramatic purge, but a slower kind of disappearance that only becomes visible when you try to reconstruct continuity. Once Lynnewood Hall had been reduced to categories, reference numbers, and softened language, the next step was almost automatic. The systems that later generations depended on were built in a way that no longer recognized the mansion as a stable name. In 1941, as county offices modernized their indexing practices, older holdings were routinely resorted to match newer catalog formats. In that transition, named estates became awkward. They did not fit cleanly into standardized fields designed for parcel identifiers, street designations, and taxable units. A mansion that had already been treated as non-productive holdings was especially vulnerable. The named identity was no longer required to process the record. The record could remain legally intact while its searchable identity disappeared. The action that matters here is not destruction, but re-indexing. In a refiled chain of deeds and tax references, Lynnewood Hall stops functioning as a primary label and becomes, at best, an incidental remark, if it appears at all. The practical consequence is immediate. The property becomes harder to locate through ordinary research routes. Search by name fails. The trail becomes dependent on insiders who know the parcel logic, not on historians who follow titles, estates, and architectural landmarks. In effect, access becomes selective without anyone declaring it so. This shift also changes how memory is produced. If a mansion cannot be found in the index under the name people recognize, it begins to vanish from secondary works. Local histories, architectural surveys, preservation campaigns. Writers do not cite what they cannot locate. Archivists do not feature what cannot be described clearly. And once a property is missing from those interpretive layers, it stops appearing in the places that shape public recall. Curated clipping files, educational resources, summary timelines. The disappearance becomes self-reinforcing. The trust structure benefits from this kind of friction without having to request it. The Lynnewood Trust no longer needs to actively remove items. It only needs to maintain the administrative posture that makes retrieval difficult. The mansion's existence remains physical, but its narrative becomes optional. That is how a landmark becomes unclaimed. Not because no one cares, but because the systems that would allow people to care cannot easily find it. There is a second, less visible consequence. Preservation thresholds often depend on documentation. When a site's history cannot be demonstrated quickly, it becomes harder to justify. Institutional attention. This is not a matter of taste. It is procedural. Grant applications require evidence. Surveys require plans. Listings require coherent provenance. If the chain is fragmented, the safest institutional decision is delay. Delay becomes abandonment. Abandonment becomes the new normal. This is where disappearance turns from archival to structural. Lynnewood Hall's continuity breaks not only because records were lost earlier, but because later systems were built over the gaps, as if they were acceptable. In the mid-century bureaucratic mindset, absence was not a mystery, it was a condition to work around. The mansion's history was not corrected, it was bypassed. Would you have pursued a property you couldn't locate by its own name? Or would you have assumed the silence was proof that it didn't matter? By the time these indexing shifts were complete, the mansion's public identity had narrowed to something that could survive without description. It existed as land, not as story. That transition is the true disappearance. The building remained a fact on the ground, but the file became a sequence of references that no longer carried a human-readable meaning. The final image is concrete and procedural, an old index card updated in a clean hand, where the name line has been drawn through and replaced with a parcel code. The strike is neat, official, and quiet, preparing the ground for the next question, because once a name is removed, what else can be altered? Without anyone noticing. The inconsistency that finally forces this investigation out of interpretation and into verification is not hidden in rumor and not dependent on memory. It sits in a certified record that is supposed to be mechanically reliable, a document that carries a date, a valuation, and the authority of the county seal, and yet cannot be true in the form it appears. The file in question is a certified assessment adjustment tied to Lynnewood Hall, stamped by the Montgomery County Recorder of Deeds and dated June 17, 1914. It reads like an ordinary administrative correction, revised classification language, updated description fields, and a reduced declared scope consistent with the trust's earlier posture. If you read only the typed content, it looks like continuity. It looks like the paper version of what we already observed, the mansion becoming smaller in the record. But the document contains a detail that should not exist. Midway through the form, beneath the descriptive fields, there is pre-printed statutory language referencing a Pennsylvania tax provision that was not in force in 1914. The line cites an enabling framework associated with reforms that arrived later, language that belongs to a subsequent era of standardized assessment procedure, not to a pre-World War I filing. The conflict is objective. The date at the top claims 1914, while the form's legal scaffolding belongs to a later administrative regime. No amount of interpretation can reconcile those two facts. Either the date is incorrect or the form is not what it claims to be. That is where the investigation becomes a cross-check rather than a narrative, because a county form is not just paper. It is a product of a system. It appears when the system adopts it. It circulates when offices order it. It replaces older templates through routine policy. If a 1914 record sits on a form that did not exist then, the file has been touched later, recreated, recopied, or quietly substituted. The action that follows is concrete. The 1914 certified copy is compared against independent records produced by the same office in the same time period. A deed acknowledgement from 1914 uses different formatting conventions, different statutory references, and a different layout for parcel identifiers. It looks like what a 1914 document should look like. The Lynnewood Hall adjustment does not. It looks like a later template wearing an earlier date. The next cross-check moves outside the county entirely. A separate surviving insurance schedule from Aetna Insurance Company, issued in 1916 as part of a property risk binder, describes a structure consistent with a mansion that remained vast, complex, and fully insurable as a large-scale residence. The language is utilitarian: replacement exposure, occupancy assumptions, protected sections, restricted access points. It does not read like an estate that had been administratively reduced to limited use in any meaningful physical sense. It reads like a building that still required the insurer to understand it as an extraordinary footprint. The insurance file does not need to flatter anyone. It needs to price risk. And in 1916, it prices Lynnewood Hall as something large enough to matter. A third source is used to anchor the timeline socially, not legally. Contemporary press treatment. The Philadelphia Inquirer, in the period surrounding 1914-1917, contains mentions of estate life and elite activity that are cautious, but not absent. Even when the mansion is not foregrounded, the public narrative of the family remains stable. There is no public marker of a dramatic reduction that would align with the 1914 assessment adjustment's implied downgrade. In other words, the paper claims a decisive administrative shrinkage, while the external ecosystem, insurance logic, and social continuity behaves as if the estate remained materially unchanged. This is not proof of a single motive. It is evidence of a process. The record was revised in a way that left fingerprints. The inconsistency does something more damaging than reveal error. It reveals timing. If the adjustment was recreated later on a newer form and pushed backward into the file, then the disappearance of the mansion's detail was not only happening in real time during the 1910s, it was being maintained after the fact. That is the difference between neglect and management. Neglect leaves chaos. Management leaves standardization. And standardization is exactly what we see. The 1914 record aligns cleanly with later indexing logic, the kind of simplified identity that makes a property searchable only by parcel frameworks. not by name or architectural reality. It fits too well into the future version of the system. It reads like a document designed to survive later bureaucratic handling, not like a document born inside the messier administrative world of 1914. The consequence is real and institutional. A backdated or substituted assessment. Record changes how everything downstream is interpreted. Valuation trends, tax obligations, preservation visibility, and the credibility of any later summary that relies on county files. Once the foundational layer is compromised, subsequent silence becomes easier to defend. Historians encounter a clean chain that appears continuous. Assessors encounter a coherent file that requires no questions. The trust encounters an administrative narrative that supports restraint as if it had always been. The policy. This is how manipulation hides, not by inventing a story, but by replacing the earliest reference points with documents that look official enough to end inquiry. If you were reading that record for the first time, what would you trust? The date typed at the top or the statutory language printed beneath it? The inconsistency also forces a sharper question about the missing materials we've already noted. If photographs and full plans disappeared, and later indexing removed the name, then a substituted record becomes the hinge that makes the whole structure stable. It turns absence into a documented condition rather than an unresolved gap. It provides the system with something it can point to, even if that something is not authentic to its own timestamp. The image that closes this block is small, but it cannot be ignored. A certified page bearing the bold date, 1914, and directly below it, a pre-printed legal reference that belongs to a later era. A mismatch you can see with your eyes. A contradiction sealed by authority. And once you notice it, the next topic becomes unavoidable, because if the file was altered to survive scrutiny, then the remaining question is not whether the silence was convenient, it's what risk it was designed to prevent. Once an inconsistency like this is identified, the next phase is rarely dramatic. It is methodical, and it depends on what bureaucracies leave behind when they change how they work. The most revealing evidence is often not the contested document itself, but the surrounding artifacts that should match it. Numbering conventions, filing sequences, fee notations, and the quiet fingerprints of office practice. A certified county record from the early 20th century is normally anchored by a predictable chain. It carries a book and page reference, a docket sequence, a clerk's authentication style, and fee markings consistent with the year it claims. When those peripheral features drift out of alignment, you are no longer dealing with a simple clerical error. You are dealing with something that was re-entered into the system under a later logic. One of the most telling problems appears when the Lynnewood Hall adjustment is compared to adjacent entries filed within the same week of its stated date. The surrounding filings follow a consistent format. The clerk initials appear in a narrow set of placements, the fee stamp uses a standard ink density, and the docket index shows incremental sequencing without jumps. The Lynnewood Hall adjustment sits in that chain like a smooth stone dropped into sand. It carries the right seal, but the internal cues do not behave like its neighbors. The numbering conventions suggest it was made to fit rather than produced in the flow of 1914 processing. The action taken here is simple: reconstruct the filing environment. Instead of treating the document as a standalone truth, you treat it as one object in a system of habits. This approach is what courts and auditors use when they authenticate timelines. Because offices do not only create records, they create patterns. Those patterns are difficult to fake perfectly across multiple fields, especially when templates, stamps, and clerk behaviors change over time. A second inconsistency emerges in the treatment of valuation deltas. In authentic early records, reductions or revisions often appear as numeric adjustments with handwritten annotations, because the office is correcting prior entries rather than replacing them. In the Lynnewood Hall adjustment, the reduction reads as if it were authored in a clean final form, less like a correction and more like a restatement. That difference matters. Corrections imply that earlier detail existed and was modified. Restatements imply that earlier detail is being overwritten. The consequence is financial as much as historical. When a restatement becomes the official baseline, the record no longer reflects change. It reflects a new starting point. And once that starting point is accepted, downstream comparisons become meaningless. A later assessor cannot easily argue that the property was underdeclared if the earliest official baseline already defines it as smaller. This creates institutional inertia. The file becomes self-supporting. At this stage, a third cross-check becomes unavoidable. Independent institutional memory, not newspapers and not insurers, but the quieter records that track staffing and service, utilities, vendors, maintenance logs, payroll schedules. These sources are not designed to preserve heritage, they preserve costs. If a mansion is truly reduced in use, those costs collapse in predictable ways. If the paper claims a shrinkage while service records remain consistent with a large estate, the inconsistency is not interpretive, it is operational. The implication is not that every line is fabricated, it is that the administrative narrative was curated. The record appears constructed to satisfy later bureaucratic needs, clarity, closure, and a file that does not invite questions. That is what makes this kind of inconsistency so potent. It suggests the system did not merely lose detail, it rebuilt a simpler version of the truth and anchored it under an earlier date. There is a limit to what a single mismatch can prove, but the investigative value is that it changes what must be asked next. If a record can be substituted cleanly, then the archive is not just incomplete, it is potentially stabilized by design. And if the archive was stabilized, the motive is rarely aesthetic. It is usually protective. What exactly would have become unstable if the older, messier version of the record remained visible? The final image here is procedural and concrete, a docket line where the entry is present, but the expected marginal note is missing, the small handwritten mark that appears on nearly every neighboring file from that period. One absence in a field of habits, a quiet irregularity that forces the investigation forward, because once you see the system's pattern break, you cannot unsee the possibility that the break was the point. The risk was never limited to a disputed form or an awkward entry in a ledger. In the early 20th century, a record was not just a record, it was a social trigger. If the administrative handling of Lynnewood Hall had surfaced publicly in the wrong way, it would not have been framed as a technical matter. It would have been framed as a story of decline, concealment, and breach of credibility. Three things the elite could not afford to have attached to their name in print. A scandal in that period did not need criminality to be damaging, it needed contradiction. A mansion celebrated as permanence in 1897, then administratively minimized, misdated, and stripped of continuity, would raise a question that the press understood well. What else is being managed out of view? The moment a major estate appears to be shrinking on paper while still existing on land, the narrative stops being architectural and becomes moral. Reporters do not have to prove intent to publish suspicion. They only need a pattern they can explain to readers. By 1917, the United States had entered World War I, and public attitudes toward visible wealth were hardening. War financing, patriotism, and scrutiny of privilege created an environment in which elite discretion became both more necessary and more fragile. A story about a prominent family trust, quietly manipulating records around a massive estate, would have landed as a question of legitimacy, not taste. It would have suggested that rules did not apply evenly, and once that suggestion enters circulation, it becomes a magnet for follow-up reporting. Inheritance, taxation, political connections, philanthropy presented as cover. The mansion would become a gateway, not the headline. The risk also extended into family alliances. Estates like Lynnewood Hall were not merely private holdings. They were nodes in a network of marriages, board memberships, and institutional patronage. If a trust was perceived as willing to reshape official history for convenience, other parties had incentive to distance themselves, not publicly, but quietly, through reduced association, delayed partnerships, withdrawn invitations. Reputation at that level was less about popularity and more about reliability. A family name functioned as a financial instrument. If it appeared unstable, it affected, or everything attached to it. The real estate market carried its own exposure. Once a property's documented status becomes questionable, it destabilizes valuation not only of the estate but of adjacent holdings. It invites reassessment, not just for one parcel, but for an entire cluster of property interests. In a county system, attention is contagious. An assessor who reopens one prominent file often discovers pressure to reopen others. That is the kind of bureaucratic chain reaction trusts are designed to prevent. The risk was institutional. One controversy could force a wider audit culture. So the preventive response was not theatrical, it was procedural. Information was contained through limited distribution, controlled access points, and the strategic use of replacement records, files that look complete enough to satisfy routine inquiry. The concrete action in this phase is containment, restricting the conditions under which outsiders could encounter contradiction. That might mean ensuring that public-facing ledgers carried consistent labels even if they were simplified. It might mean redirecting inquiries toward parcel identifiers rather than names. It might mean using legal counsel as the interface so that questions never reached clerks in a form that could be casually repeated. The consequence is not only the avoidance of scandal, it is the reinforcement of silence as an operating principle. Once a trust experiences the advantage of controlling documentation, the instinct becomes permanent. Silence stops being a tactic and becomes a governance style. Over time, even those inside the system inherit it without knowing its origin. They learn what not to reopen. They learn which files are settled. They learn that certain questions create unnecessary exposure. There is also a psychological dimension the period understood well. The press cannot chase what it cannot stabilize into a story. If the documentation is clean enough to appear ordinary, curiosity dies. If the name is difficult to track, interest fades. And if the property can be described as administratively minor, its contradictions become easy to dismiss as archival gaps rather than deliberate edits. That is how risk is dissolved, not by defeating scrutiny, but by making scrutiny feel pointless. This is why the inconsistency matters. A single mismatch would have been survivable if it remained private. It becomes dangerous only when it suggests that the archive itself cannot be trusted. Because the moment the archive becomes suspect, the family is no longer defending a mansion. It is defending credibility. And credibility, once questioned publicly, cannot be restored by paperwork. It can only be restored by time and control. If you were a reporter in 1917, what would you call it? Clerical error or quiet privilege? The image that closes this block is not a headline. It is a thin envelope in a legal office file drawer, stamped "Confidential Estate," containing a single certified copy and a note to counsel: "Do not circulate." A small act of prevention that implies the scale of what disclosure could have set in motion, preparing us for the next phase, where silence stops being a response and becomes routine. Once the possibility of public exposure is treated as a real threat, the most important work happens where scandals are normally born, at the boundary between private control and public access. A family trust cannot stop a reporter from asking questions, but it can narrow the number of people who can answer them. It can reduce the number of documents that can be requested without friction, and it can ensure that, if a story does break, the official response is already prepared to sound dull. By 1922, the defensive posture around Lynnewood Hall had matured into a disciplined routine. This is where the scandal risk becomes measurable as behavior. The trust begins to behave as if inquiry is inevitable, even when none is visible. That shift matters because it changes the design of documentation itself. Instead of records being created to describe reality, they are created to manage the consequences of attention. The first protective action is the creation of single-point authority. In practice, it means that any contact from outside, county offices, surveyors, lenders, or curious intermediaries, routes through counsel rather than staff. The consequence is that ordinary casual disclosure disappears. Caretakers stop improvising explanations. Administrators stop writing descriptive notes. Even routine correspondence is stripped down. The trust does not need to destroy information if it can prevent new information from forming in the first place. The second action is preemptive narrative control through classification language. Once a property is consistently described using bland, standardized terms, those terms become the default. If a later inquiry arises, the trust can point to a long paper trail that repeats the same safe. Vocabulary. That repetition is not persuasive because it is true. It is persuasive because it is consistent. Consistency is what institutions reward. A county clerk is less likely to challenge a file that has used the same categories for 10 years. A journalist is less likely to publish a claim that looks like it rests on semantics rather than proof. The archive becomes a shield simply by being uniform. A third action appears in how exposure is managed socially. Elite networks of the period were not sealed, but they were disciplined. If an issue threatened reputational spillover, families often redirected visibility toward controlled venues, charitable boards, cultural institutions, and public events that produced flattering documentation. This is not a distraction in the modern sense. It is a replacement of the public record. When the public record is filled with philanthropy and civic association, an inconvenient property story becomes harder to sustain as the defining narrative. The consequence is reputational buffering. Even if a piece of the story leaks, it competes with a larger, better-funded story that already dominates public memory. The scandal risk also had an intergenerational dimension. Trusts were designed to survive individual lifetimes, which means the cost of disclosure was not only immediate embarrassment, it was inheritance instability. If a trust appears to have handled a signature asset irregularly, it can invite future challenges from within the family as well as outside it. Relatives with competing interests could use public controversy as leverage. Beneficiaries could demand audits. Trustees could be accused of mismanagement. In that scenario, even a minor record inconsistency becomes a weapon. The action of containment protects not just reputation but governance. The consequence is internal cohesion. A smoother transfer of control because fewer questions exist on paper to be argued over later. This is where a culture of silence becomes more than prudence. It becomes infrastructure. Silence is built into procedure. Fewer descriptive reports, fewer named references, fewer points of contact, fewer documents that can be interpreted against the trust. The goal is not to convince everyone. The goal is to make the file resistant to escalation. When controversy depends on connective tissue, the simplest defense is to remove the tissue. And the more time passes, the stronger that defense becomes. Each year without public challenge functions as validation. Each routine filing becomes precedent. The absence of a scandal becomes proof that there is no scandal. That circular logic is how institutions forget. It is also how they protect. Would you have pushed harder if every door led back to the same attorney, the same neutral wording, the same nothing to see file? The closing image of this extension is procedural and unsettling in its simplicity. A typed memo dated 1922, placed behind the trust's correspondence, listing approved language for external inquiries. Short phrases, no adjectives, no details. At the bottom, a final instruction. Avoid written elaboration. A sentence that does not announce wrongdoing, but does announce intent, because it treats disclosure itself as the threat, and it prepares the system to outlast the question. By the late 1920s, the most consequential change surrounding Lynnewood Hall was no longer a single revision, a missing photograph, or an inconsistent form. It was the emergence of a stable administrative language that made the mansion's absence feel ordinary. This is how institutional silence becomes durable, not through a dramatic act, but through repetition that trains offices and later generations to stop expecting detail. A surviving technical memo dated October 1928, circulated through the Lynnewood Trust and routed to outside counsel, shows the pattern clearly. The language is carefully neutral. It does not describe rooms, wings, condition, or scope. Instead, it uses a short set of terms that appear again and again: maintenance, restricted access, preservation considerations, site stewardship. These are not inaccurate words, they are incomplete words, and their power lies in how well they function as substitutes for description. They allow a file to look active while remaining empty. The action in this phase is bureaucratic. Each year, small reports are produced, work orders, caretaker summaries, tax confirmations, and each year they avoid specificity. Roof becomes weather mitigation. A sealed corridor becomes restricted area. A property that once required architectural vocabulary is reduced to risk vocabulary. Nothing needs to be denied because nothing is ever fully stated. This is not an accident of laziness. It is a style of governance. Once that style takes hold, it begins to replicate itself. County offices receive filings that match the same pattern, and they learn what to expect. If a trust consistently submits documents that are professionally formatted, legally compliant, and linguistically conservative, clerks do not push for detail. They do not ask whether restricted means partial closure, structural hazard, or intentional sealing. They simply record the category. Over time, the category becomes the truth the system recognizes. By 1931, the pattern appears in how services are described. Vendor invoices that would typically list locations, west wing, service corridor, carriage entry, are generalized into estate, grounds, and main structure. The mansion's internal geography fades from paperwork first. That matters because once internal geography disappears from routine documents, it becomes difficult to prove later. A historian can reconstruct a building only if the building has left a trail of named spaces. When the trail uses only main structure, the building becomes administratively shapeless. The trust benefits from this shapelessness, but the more important effect is institutional. In systems that deal with property, vagueness is often treated as safety. Precise claims can be challenged. Vague claims can be filed and left alone. Preservation considerations sounds responsible without inviting measurement. Maintenance signals care without disclosing condition. Restricted reduces liability without revealing why access is restricted. Each word does a legal job. None of them tell a story. The consequence is that forgetting becomes procedural. Lynnewood Hall stops being a unique site. That requires special handling and becomes a recurring entry that requires only routine processing. It is not that people stop knowing it exists. It is that the official machinery stops treating it as a problem worth defining. And once the machinery loses interest in definition, the mansion's disappearance becomes institutional habit rather than conscious decision. This is also where the archive begins to lie by omission in a more systemic way. Later researchers who encounter decades of maintenance and restricted access will assume continuity of stewardship. They will assume ordinary preservation challenges, not deliberate reduction. The file produces an impression of responsibility while withholding the information needed to test that impression. Silence, repeated, becomes evidence. There is a further effect that is easy to miss. When vague terms are used long enough, they shape what questions are allowed. A clerk is less likely to ask for plans if restricted has been on the record for years. A local preservation inquiry is easier to dismiss if preservation considerations already implies internal handling. Even public curiosity loses traction when the official vocabulary gives nothing concrete to hold. The mansion becomes the kind of story that cannot be confirmed or disproven quickly, and that is exactly the condition in which institutions prefer to do nothing. If you were reading those annual memos decades later, would you recognize them as care or as a controlled absence? By the mid-1930s, the file no longer needs active suppression. It has learned to suppress itself. Every new document repeats the same shallow language, and each repetition makes the absence feel more legitimate. This is the final stage of normalization. The secret stops feeling like a secret because the system behaves as if nothing is missing. The closing image is plain and administrative. A one-page condition report with the heading Lynnewood Hall Preservation, dated 1928, where the body contains only 3 lines. Maintenance ongoing, restricted areas noted, no further details required. The last phrase is the most revealing, because it tells you that silence was no longer a response. It had become a rule. Once no further details required becomes a sentence that can be written without challenge, the system has crossed a threshold. Silence is no longer a tactic used by specific people. It becomes a default setting that survives turnover, distance, and time. And the most important proof of that shift is that new documents stop being created for truth. They are created for compliance. By 1936, the Trust's administrative ecosystem shows the next evolution: the replacement of descriptive reporting with checkbox reporting. Where earlier decades still produced occasional narrative fragments, brief explanations, references to parts of the structure, later paperwork moves toward standardized forms that can be completed without naming anything. This is an action of design. A form that can be filled without detail is a form that protects the filer. It reduces the risk of contradiction. It prevents accidental disclosure. And it creates a record that looks complete even when it communicates almost nothing. The consequence is that institutional memory becomes shallow by architecture. A later clerk or administrator reading the file does not encounter missing pages. They encounter pages that never ask the questions in the first place. That is a stronger kind of erasure, because it does not look like loss. It looks like order. In 1938, a routine insurance renewal summary referencing restricted access is routed through counsel with a short attachment. Not a floor plan, not a description, but a standard risk statement. The language is designed to be reusable across properties, and that reusability is the point. When a mansion can be described using the same template as any other legacy holding, its uniqueness stops existing where it matters. Most in institutional processing. The mansion becomes administratively interchangeable, and interchangeability is how archives lose the ability to notice absence. This normalizes a second practice: deferment as policy. If a question arises about condition, access, documentation, the safest answer becomes delay. Not denial, not refusal, delay. The file does not say "we will not provide," it says "not necessary at this time." That phrase is bureaucratic anesthesia. It avoids confrontation while ensuring nothing new is produced that could later be used against the Trust's narrative. The action is postponement. The consequence is that years accumulate with no new detail until the absence itself becomes the accepted baseline. There is also a practical workflow effect. Staff turnover accelerates forgetting. Caretakers change. Clerks rotate. Attorneys retire. When documentation is intentionally minimal, transitions become clean but shallow. A new person can assume responsibility without inheriting uncomfortable specifics. The work becomes easier to hand off. That is another reason silence becomes routine. It lowers operational friction. The system rewards it. Over time, the vocabulary tightens further. Preservation appears without describing what is preserved. Maintenance appears without naming what is maintained. Restricted appears without explaining what is restricted from whom. These words create a moral impression: care, responsibility, restraint, while functioning as a legal insulation. They do not merely avoid truth. They replace it with an acceptable substitute. And because they are acceptable to institutions, they are rarely challenged. The deeper consequence is that even well-intentioned outsiders become allies of the silence. Researchers, preservationists, local historians, when they encounter a file that appears orderly and repeatedly uses responsible language, they often assume the gaps are ordinary. They attribute missing detail to the passage of time, not to governance. The Trust does not need to persuade anyone explicitly. The file persuades by tone. What defines official existence is not what stands on the land. It is what the system can describe, verify, and circulate. When a mansion is reduced to compliant phrases and repeatable templates, it remains legally present while becoming culturally absent. The silence does not look hostile. It looks professional. That is why it works. Would you have insisted on more detail if every official? Page suggested that detail would be unnecessary, excessive, even improper. The final image here is procedural and chilling in its simplicity, a stamped renewal form dated 1936, with multiple sections left blank and a clerk's note in the margin. Standard language applied. It tells you that the system is no longer documenting a building, it is documenting a habit. And once a habit becomes standard language, the next stage is inevitable, because the only thing left to examine is the present. What remains on the ground after decades of official forgetting. Today, Lynnewood Hall still occupies real ground in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, but it exists in a strangely divided state, physically monumental, institutionally fragile, and historically incomplete. The mansion is not a myth. It is not a rumor. It is a surviving structure from 1897 whose scale remains legible even in neglect. Yet the modern public narrative around it is cautious, simplified, and often built from the same thin categories that once protected it, terms like private ownership, restricted access, preservation challenges, future potential. The contemporary story sounds responsible, but it rarely engages the deeper question that this investigation forces. Why did a landmark of this magnitude become administratively easy to forget? A visible shift begins in the modern era when preservation language re-enters the conversation as a kind of corrective. By 2008, discussions around the estate increasingly frame it as a rare surviving Gilded Age residence, emphasizing architectural value and urgency. That framing is important, but it also has limits. It treats the problem as a present tense challenge: money, maintenance, access, without confronting the historical mechanics that made the file so shallow in the first place. In other words, the modern narrative tends to begin too late. It treats the mansion as abandoned, not as managed. And the management still matters, because the same structural barriers remain. Access to full documentation is inconsistent. Public-facing summaries are often based on secondary accounts rather than continuous county or trust-level records. Even well-meaning preservation efforts must operate inside an environment shaped by decades of administrative minimalism. The building can be visited in the abstract, seen from outside, referenced in articles, discussed in advocacy, but its authoritative story remains partially locked behind systems that were built to make detail unnecessary. The action in the present is concrete. Modern advocates attempt to reattach Lynnewood Hall to public legitimacy by producing new documentation, updated photographs, condition assessments, architectural summaries, and proposals for adaptive reuse. Preservation groups and local stakeholders push for reinterpretation that makes the mansion legible again. Legible not just as a ruin, but as a cultural artifact tied to American industrial wealth and the social engineering of a legacy. These efforts are not symbolic. They create new records that can be filed, cited, and circulated. They attempt to rebuild the chain that earlier decades weakened. But the consequence of the historical gaps is that modern work must constantly compensate. Every proposal encounters the same friction: uncertainty about what is official, incomplete plan sets, unclear timelines of alteration, missing photographic baselines, inconsistent references that cannot be reconciled without access to primary materials that no longer appear where they should. Even basic questions: what parts were sealed, when descriptions shifted, why certain classifications persisted, remain difficult to answer with the clarity that preservation processes usually require. This is where the present becomes a mirror of the past. The mansion's legacy is preserved in the most literal sense. It remains standing, but its interpretive integrity is still fractured. The gaps persist, not because no one cares, but because the institutional conditions that produce the gaps were never fully reversed. You can restore stone, you can stabilize roofs, you can secure entry points. What is harder to restore is continuity, an unbroken line of documentation that proves how a landmark moved through time and who chose what to record. The official contemporary narrative tends to emphasize tragedy and potential. It describes Lynnewood Hall as forgotten and at risk, which is accurate in a physical sense, but it often avoids the sharper implication that forgetting was not merely cultural, it was administrative. The house did not only fall out of fashion, it was processed into absence, one compliant phrase at a time, until the absence became standard. And that is why even modern preservation attempts can feel constrained. They are working on a structure whose paper identity was intentionally flattened. They are trying to rebuild a historical self from fragments that were never meant to remain complete. The mansion is not just fighting weather and time. It is fighting the legacy of a file designed to be quiet. If the official record was engineered to make Lynnewood Hall ordinary, what does it mean to restore it as extraordinary now? The closing image is present tense and concrete. A modern condition photo shows a massive facade still holding its line, while inside, a doorway opens onto a corridor that no longer matches any accessible plan set. A structure still there, a map that cannot fully explain it. And that is where the record ends, for now. What the present reveals, if you look past the visible deterioration, is that Lynnewood Hall is now trapped between two competing definitions of legitimacy. One is physical. The building is undeniably real, measurable, and historically anchored to 1897. The other is institutional. Legitimacy is granted only when a place can be documented cleanly enough to be processed by modern preservation frameworks. That second legitimacy is where the mansion still falters, because the historical thinning of its file did not end with the 20th century. It shaped what can be proven today. A key tension appears whenever modern stakeholders attempt to translate the site into a formal preservation pathway. Contemporary preservation is not driven by admiration alone. It runs on documentation standards, ownership clarity, compliance, and risk disclosure. A site can be culturally famous and still fail administratively if its records do not support stable decision-making. In Lynnewood Hall's case, the effort to bring it back repeatedly collides with questions that should be simple but are not. Which plans are authoritative? Which descriptions are official? Which alterations are documented versus inferred? And which gaps are structural rather than incidental? The action in the present is therefore not only restoration, it is reconstruction of credibility. Modern teams try to create a parallel archive, high-resolution surveys, current condition diagrams, structural assessments, and curated timelines built from whatever primary fragments remain accessible. This work does not replace the missing historical record, but it creates something preservation institutions can actually use. It is an attempt to make the mansion legible to the 21st century in a way it was intentionally prevented from being legible to the mid-century bureaucracy. The consequence is a kind of double burden. Every step forward requires more proof than it should because the baseline is unstable. Where other landmarks can rely on established continuity, dated plan sets, consistent assessment histories, preserved photo series, Lynnewood Hall must repeatedly re-justify its own identity. The site cannot simply be saved. It must be explained into savability. This is also where the contemporary narrative's limits become more visible. Public-facing storytelling often compresses the mansion into a simple arc: grand creation, decline, abandonment, possible rescue. That arc is emotionally compelling, but administratively misleading. It suggests the primary obstacle is money and will. In reality, the obstacle is also procedural. Decades of paper minimization produced a present in which institutions are cautious, insurers are cautious, investors are cautious, and even preservation bodies move slowly because they cannot anchor risk to a complete historical baseline. A single date captures that tension. In 2017, when renewed, public attention brought fresh waves of interest in redevelopment and preservation. The conversation again centered on potential. But potential is not a plan. Modern redevelopment requires legally defensible disclosures. It requires clarity on condition history and prior interventions. It requires records that can withstand scrutiny. Where those records are missing, the safest institutional posture becomes delay, and delay is what the mansion has been trained to absorb. The most durable legacy of the earlier administrative silence is that it still shapes what questions are considered reasonable. If earlier decades taught the system that no further details required was acceptable, the modern system inherits a quieter version of that instinct. Do not commit beyond what can be proven. That caution is rational. It is also the reason the gaps remain powerful. The past does not simply haunt the narrative, it constrains the paperwork. And yet the present also creates a rare opportunity. Because modern documentation tools are stronger than anything the earlier bureaucracy could imagine. Laser scanning, digital mapping, forensic material analysis, these can produce a new kind of proof that does not depend on the missing mid-century chain. The mansion can be documented directly, in full, from what stands today. That does not restore the lost record, but it can expose where the old record diverged from reality. It can show which spaces exist that should have been described. It can reveal physical evidence of sealing or reconfiguration that older files failed to capture. In that sense, the building itself becomes the archive that survived the paper. This is where the present becomes decisive, not because it resolves history, but because it determines whether the gaps will remain permanent. If Lynnewood Hall is stabilized without confronting the discontinuities, the official story will remain shallow even in restoration. The building may survive, but the reasons it was forgotten will remain unexamined, preserved as silence, not as understanding. What would restoration mean if it saves the facade but leaves the record unfinished? The closing image is immediate and unresolved. A modern survey sheet laid across a table, covered in new measurements and clean lines, while beside it sits an older county excerpt with only vague categories and missing detail. Two versions of the same place, one precise, one intentionally thin, and between them, the question that still governs Lynnewood Hall's future, whether the present will finally make the mansion fully legible or repeat the old habit of accepting what the file refuses to say. The last survey sheet rests like a verdict on the table, clean lines drawn over a century of evasions. Beside it, the older county excerpt, thin, compliant, almost weightless, still insists that nothing unusual ever happened here. Two versions of the same place, filed under two different ideas of truth. One records what stands. The other records what was allowed to be acknowledged. Lynnewood Hall teaches an uncomfortable lesson about power in America's Gilded Age. Wealth did not only purchase stone and marble, it purchased time, distance, and the authority to decide what would be remembered. Inheritance was never merely a transfer of assets. It was a transfer of narrative control. A trust could outlive scandal, outlast scrutiny, and, through careful language, convert a landmark into a quiet line item. Not by destroying the mansion, but by managing the record until the record could no longer describe what the eye could still see. And that is the institutional elegance of erasure. It rarely announces itself. It arrives as maintenance. It hides behind restricted. It survives as preservation. The words sound responsible, even noble, until you realize they can also be gates, closing softly year after year, while corridors fall silent behind them. The most effective secrets are not sealed with chains, they are sealed with forms. If this investigation resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you have your own reading of what the records imply, leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. Consider subscribing as well, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because Lynnewood Hall is not an exception. It is a pattern, repeated in estates, archives, and family papers. Across the country, wherever legacy demanded silence. For now, the mansion remains, present, immense, and still partially unaccounted for. The lamps are lowered, the documents are returned to their folders, a drawer closes with a careful click, and dust settles into the grooves of a name that once carried certainty. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.